Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
It's time to turn off the lights and turn on the dark.
Chilling tales for dark nights.
Good evening, listeners, and welcome back to Chilling Tales for Dark Nights. I'm your host, Geoff Sturtevant, and tonight I'll be your guide as we navigate the dimly lit corridors of your darkest dreams. Before we begin, a quick reminder that your support means everything to us. If you're enjoying the show, please take a moment to leave a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening. Watching on YouTube? Give this video a thumbs up, drop a comment, and hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to ring the bell icon so you never miss an episode. And if you want even more spine-chilling content, head over to chillingtalesfordarknights.com where you can become a patron and unlock ad-free episodes, exclusive stories, and early access to brand new nightmares before anyone else. Your support keeps the nightmares alive. And the lights on, of course. I mean, off. The lights here are always off. I'm all by my lonesome in the studio tonight, but I've got something very special for you. From nosleep legend Thomas O. This story takes place in the Seer of Possibilities universe, based on the well-known creepypasta of the same name, in which a timeless being takes shape among men and manipulates their futures with its supernatural intuition. And bringing this story to life tonight is a channel favorite, the one and only Nick Goroff. So sit back, settle in, and prepare for a truly disturbing tale, courtesy of author Thomas O. by way of Velox Books. A tale of beauty and deception, in which a mysterious collector's eye falls upon two young artists. It's tough to be subjective, though, when you already know how certain art will be received. So without further ado, I present to you Second Seer, a story of death and beauty.
The two college students, Shelley Hester and Mona Darling, got off at the wrong bus stop and ended up at Mr. Vitier's place completely by accident. They'd been trying to find a used record store someone had told them about, and they would have been successful if only they'd gotten off on 6th Street. But they didn't. Maybe they missed their stop because Mona was too busy applying her crimson lipstick. Or maybe the friends simply weren't paying enough attention. Regardless, the girls stayed on the bus for one stop too many and found themselves to be someplace they hadn't planned on. As the bus departed, the girls stood along the unfamiliar street, still unaware that they'd gotten off at the wrong place. Mona, who'd recently developed a preference for listening to music on old-style vinyl records, attempted to justify their trip into unfamiliar territory.
If you really want to hear music in its purest form, then vinyl is the best way. You've said that 3 times today already. And anyway, since when do you care about purity?
Shelley responded. Mona ignored the question.
Where's the record shop at?
She asked, while slowly surveying the area. Both girls quickly realized their mistake. The part of town in which they found themselves was an older, quieter section of the city. There was no record store in the area. Instead, dirty facades of mostly empty businesses lined up along the street. Shelley pointed to a small building at the end of the way, the last among a row of stores. Its red brick construction made it look older and more mysterious than the other buildings in the area. She assumed that it must have been a business of some sort, but there was no outside signage to indicate what was sold on the inside. The allure of the uncommon structure proved to be too strong for Shelley, who pointed in its direction.
Let's see what that is. It looks like a funky little store.
Mona disagreed with her friend.
It's not the record shop, and we don't have time for anything else. If we wait here for the next bus, we might still make it before closing. It'll be quick,
Shelley shouted over her shoulder as she walked briskly toward the brick building. She walked alone, becoming more worried with every step that Mona wouldn't follow her, but eventually she heard her friend running to catch up. Shelley turned and waited, and she took the opportunity to stealthily focus on the curves of Mona's hips. Her gaze slowly shifted upwards towards Mona's beautiful crimson lips, but she averted her eyes before her friend could notice the lustful look. Though there was no signage on the outside of the building, a handwritten open sign was propped up on the windowsill. The two girls glanced at the sign, shrugged their shoulders, and entered. The first thing they saw was a stack of books, and then even more books behind that first stack. Some books were newer, but many appeared to be quite old. Stepping through the aisles of piled volumes, the girls took note of the aged tomes.
Check out how old some of these are,
Mona said as she pointed at a particularly dusty book. Their moment of awe was suddenly interrupted by a voice of a middle-aged man who had entered from a back room. "Hello! Welcome to my home."
Did he just say this was his home?
Shelley wondered to herself. The girl's eyes darted around, looking for some indication as to the true nature of the place they were in. It was at that point that Shelley noticed there was no cash register, no signs on the walls, and no price tags on anything. Most of the books were distributed along uneven shelves and on the tops of tables. The more that Shelley looked, the more evident it became that the books weren't displayed in a manner that suggested they were for sale. Still, it was clear that the original builders of the structure had intended for it to be a store, and then there was the open sign in the window. Shelley spat out an apology.
"We're sorry, sir. We didn't know this was someone's home. It's just that it looks like a store from the outside."
The man spoke again, and his calm voice put the girls at ease. "It's okay. You're not the first people to make that mistake, and I'm sure you won't be the last." Attempting to expand her friend's explanation, Mona pointed at the window.
"And the sign said we could come in."
"Yes," the man replied. "I confess I put that out sometimes. I enjoy visitors. You're both welcome to stay and look around." The man studied the girls for a moment. "I noticed the way you girls seem to be admiring these books. You must have a true appreciation for the written word. Tell me, aren't either of you writers?" Mona raised her hand in acknowledgement.
"I am, or at least I'd like to be. My name is Mona."
"Hello, Mona. My name is Mr. Vidier. I have some rare books here that you might find interesting." As he spoke, Mona became enraptured with his voice. The girl who had initially resisted the trip to the red brick building quickly found herself wanting to stay. Shelley wanted to stay and look around too, and though she wasn't quite as taken with the man as Mona seemed to be, she decided immediately that he had a trustworthy quality about him. "Many of these are early editions of well-known stories," he said to the girls. Then, addressing Shelley directly, he added, "There are some photography books over in the corner you might enjoy." Shelley wondered how the man knew that she was interested in photography, but she was too distracted by the treasure in front of her to question it further. The girls spent the next several hours looking through the books in amazement. Mona even missed her evening writing class, which was unheard of for her. As the night progressed, Shelley noticed Mona directing subtle flirtations towards Mr. Vidier. She found it to be odd. Mr. Vidier was a handsome gentleman, to be sure, but not in a way that Shelley found romantic. It was late when they finally left Mr. Vidier's place. Too late for the buses to still be running. Mr. Vidier insisted on paying for a taxi for them, with the friendly caveat that they would come and visit him the next day. "Let me see some of your writing," he said to Mona as he escorted her to the door. "Bring me a sample when you visit tomorrow. I'm interested in seeing what you have to tell the world." Mona reached into her pocket and pulled out her smartphone.
I can show you some now.
No, Mona," Mr. Vidier's silken voice protested. "I want to see your writings printed out on real paper. If you do that for me, then I'll show you my other collection." As he spoke, he put an emphasis on the word other, as if what he'd already shown them wasn't fantastic. Mona giggled.
Okay, I'll bring it tomorrow.
The girls could barely contain their excitement during the cab ride home.
He's so nice,
Shelley complimented. Mona agreed.
And sexy, too. I've never been attracted to an older man before, but there's something about the way he...
She thought for a moment.
About the way he... everything's.
It was at that point where Shelley's opinion differed from that of her friend.
He reminds me of my dad, Mona. He's great, but I just don't see him like that, she said.
The conversation lulled, and Shelley took a moment to reflect on her own emotions. She wondered if she was a bit jealous of the attention Mr. Vidier was getting from Mona, but she found it difficult to have any negative thoughts about the man. She quickly put the idea to rest. Excited, the girls showed up the next day. Mona kept her word and brought a sample of her writing, which Mr. Vidier happily accepted. "I'll read this and give you my opinion soon," he said. Mona blushed. Mr. Vidier then guided the girls to the back room. "The books that you saw yesterday are nice, but here's where I keep the truly valuable works." He motioned for the girls to enter. The girls immediately discovered that Mr. Vidier collected more than just books. Several paintings graced the walls of the room, which somehow seemed much bigger once they were inside of it. A couple of sculpted busts sat imposingly in two of the corners. Wooden file cabinets were arranged in a row along one of the walls. Old, hand-bound books graced several shelves. Large, comfortable leather couches provided seating. "Please, look around," Mr. Vidier spoke with a certain level of satisfaction in his voice. "I'll tell you now, very few people ever get the chance to enter this room. I don't want to appear too prideful, but you should consider this a great honor." Mona picked up a nearby book. It was bound by hand, and the text was handwritten as well. She read the title aloud as she examined the artifacts. "The Devil's Face" by Edgar Allan Poe. She pondered for a moment, then said, "I've read all of Poe's stories, and this isn't one of them." "It isn't?" Mr. Vidier responded with mock surprise. "Don't be so sure of yourself, Miss Darling. Mr. Poe gave that to me as payment. You're going to find many surprises here today. Why don't you sit down and read it?" Mona was already opening the book and poring over the first words. She almost remarked that Mr. Vidier should stop joking around, but the story grabbed her attention before she could do so. For her part, Shelley examined an impressionist painting on the wall. She peered closer and closer so she could see the individual brushstrokes. Mr. Vidier came up behind her. "This one was painted for me personally." Shelley looked at the painting's lower right-hand corner where the artist had painted his signature. Claude Monet, 1862. Shelley laughed at the absurdity of Mr. Vidier's words.
"Claude Monet painted this for you in 1862?
Mr. Vidier smiled confidently. "Yes, he was at a crossroads, artistically speaking, and I helped him out." Then he directed her to an old filing cabinet. "You'll find more art in here. Spectacular photographs, beautiful sketches, all sorts. It's regrettable that I don't have enough room on my walls to hang all of them. He handed her some gloves. Put these on and you may examine them. Shelley found that the gloves fit her hands perfectly. Carefully, she opened one of the file cabinets and pulled a photograph out from the front. It was sealed in a see-through sleeve. "This is amazing," she said. Then, looking back at Mr. Vidier, she commented, "Look at the eyes of this model. How did this photographer capture so much sorrow in just one picture?" "Well, look who the photographer is." Mr. Vidier motioned for her to turn the photograph so that she could see its backside. For the second time in 5 minutes, Shelley read a name from another era, along with a date that had long since passed. Johann Masterson, 1952. I've heard of him, but I don't think many people know who he is. I think he's very underrated. Indeed he is, Shelley. Only now are people starting to discover his artistry. He pointed at the photograph in her hand. And this particular picture here, you won't find it in any book. This is the only copy in existence. Then how did you get it? Mr. Vidier just smiled mysteriously. Both of you, please look around as much as you want. Wear gloves if you handle anything, and no pictures or recording of any type, please. Those are the rules. He handed a pair of gloves to Mona, who put down the Poe book only long enough to put them on. The girls sat enthralled the whole day, delving into undiscovered art. Mr. Vidier's odd statements about interacting with artists, most of whom died long before he could have been born, didn't elude the girls, but the artwork was so engaging that neither one of them bothered to question him further. Many famous artists were represented in the collection, and all of the works were dated from times in their careers when they were either just starting out or transitioning to different styles. Despite the fame of all the artists, the girls had never seen or read any of the individual pieces before. At the end of the day, Mr. Vidier invited them back again, but asked them not to tell anyone about his collection. That's a rule too, but I already know you won't break it. He gave a wink and a devilish smile as he spoke. The girls, as Mr. Vidier predicted, spoke of the collection only to each other. Questions shot from their mouths excitedly. Where do you think he got all that from? They can't be real, can they? Adoration left Mona's lips excitedly. I wish I could stay there forever, she said with a sigh. The girls returned for several days straight. Mona, who was a natural beauty, wore successively tighter clothing each day, which didn't go unnoticed by Shelley. Mr. Vidier, who was always polite, charming, and intelligent, treated Mona the same regardless of what she was wearing. On the fourth day, while Shelley was examining a particularly beautiful photograph, Mr. Vidier approached her. You have a preference for this art form, he said, as he pointed at the picture in her hand. Yes, Shelley agreed. I love photography. Of course you do. And you're good at it, aren't you? He opened a nearby cabinet as he spoke and began rustling through it, seemingly looking for something. Shelley pondered the question for a moment. I'm okay at it, I guess. It's something I really enjoy. Here it is, Mr. Vidier exclaimed as he pulled a camera out from the cabinet. Please, take a look at this, Shelley. He gave the camera to the girl, who turned it around in her hands, examining each part. 40 years ago, Mr. Vidier began. This was a very expensive camera, but now some people would tell you it belongs in a museum. There's only one company in the world that still makes film for it. Shelley flipped the latch and opened the film compartment. I've never used a camera that wasn't digital. Most people will tell you that digital photography is better in every way, but, in my opinion, you lose any sense of serendipity when you rely too much on technology. Anyway, I think you'll find that once you master this old camera, you'll have a foundation on which you can build other aspects of your art. Shelley held up the camera and took a mock picture of Mr. Vidier. He smiled for his fake photograph as he continued to speak. It's a bit ironic. I hated photography when it was in its infancy. I feared it would supplant truer art forms, but I came to love it eventually. One day, I may even come to love all this digital manipulation that's so popular nowadays. I suppose I'm always several decades behind the times. Shelley raised an eyebrow when Mr. Vidier insinuated that he was a witness to the dawn of photography, then laughed it off. Was the man crazy? She didn't know, but she was comfortable in his company. Here, let me show you how this works. Mr. Vidier took the camera back from Shelley. I think if you were to practice using this camera, you'd enjoy yourself. I have some film that you can use, and when you're done, we can develop the pictures here in my darkroom. Mr. Vidier pointed to a door which Shelley had previously assumed led to a closet.
What do you want me to photograph?
I want you to use your imagination. Take pictures of whatever you want. The most important thing is to forget everything that you've been taught in your photography classes. Just use your instincts.
But I learned a lot in those classes,
Shelley protested. Those classes are for lesser people. Tell me, Shelley, what was one of the first things they taught you? Shelley contemplated, then answered.
The rule of thirds.
Shelley, rules are good if you want to make decent pictures, but you'll never take a great picture until you learn to break the rules. Your teachers have constrained you. Shelley disagreed.
I've never felt constrained by them.
Mr. Vidier smiled. Their pointers and tips work well for the other students in your classes, but I think you're ready to move beyond all that. Mona, who was sitting nearby, couldn't help but wonder about her own artistic efforts.
Mr. Vidier, have you finished reading my story yet?
She cooed sweetly. He turned toward the pretty brunette. I've started, my dear. You have some very interesting characters indeed. I promise you a full assessment when I'm done. Mona smiled at the promise, then sank back into the comfortable couch along with the world's only copy of An Anticipation of Death, credited to Ellis Bell, which Mona knew was a pseudonym for Emily Bronte. Shelley took the camera when she left that night and spent the next morning taking pictures of various outdoor objects. With each snap of the camera, she prayed that she wouldn't let Mr. Vidier down. The girls arrived at Mr. Vidier's place later in the afternoon. Mona was frustrated that she had to wait for Shelley to finish taking photographs. She'd even briefly considered arriving early on her own, but in the end she waited because it didn't seem right to show up without her friend. Mr. Vidier gave each girl plenty of attention. With Mona, he discussed the philosophical implications of the newest novel she'd stumbled upon. With Shelley, he spent time carefully instructing her on the process for developing her own photographs. She was an especially quick learner. When her first batch was completely developed, the man examined each photo individually. These are excellent, Shelley. Look at this one here. He held up a photograph of a tent pitched under a freeway overpass. It's off-center, but it works. I think you may have learned something already. He put the photograph down. I want you to shoot at least 3 rolls of film every day, he told her. Then come here and develop them. Shelley agreed to this. Days passed. Shelley and Mona weren't even sure how many. They missed nearly all of their classes and had no regrets about it. Mr. Vidier seemed to have nothing but free time to spend with the girls, and he spoke freely about the art in his possession. Shelley kept her word and made sure to shoot photographs daily, and under Mr. Vidier's tutelage, her skill at developing film quickly matured. Mona spent most of her time reading. Holding up one particular manuscript, she asked about the author.
Stefan Redbone? I've never heard of him, but this story is one of the best I've ever read.
Mr. Vidier gently took the manuscript from Mona's hands and flipped through it. Mr. Redbone was one of the most intriguing authors I've ever met. I suppose you could say he was a misfire on my part. He wrote 4 other novels after this one, but he never published them. Sadly, they were all consumed in a fire that he set. I wish I'd had the chance to read them first, but there are no surviving copies. Even Mr. Redbone himself was consumed by that fire. Mr. Vidier sighed. The world would have loved those novels, and it would have increased the value of this particular manuscript 1,000,000-fold. Mr. Vidier placed the manuscript on the table in front of Mona, then he continued. I knew he had a tortured soul, but I'll admit that his suicide surprised me. There are very, very few happenings that I don't see beforehand. Shelley put down the sketch she was examining so that she could listen to Mr. Vidier. Mona, who was mesmerized, spoke up. So, do you see the future? There was incredulousness in her voice, but also some awe. Not as well as I once did. Mr. Vidier pointed at his eyes and ears. The senses, they lie to you. As strange as it may sound, when you're like me, your eyes cloud your true vision, and your ears can lead you down the wrong path from time to time. The man's polished words carried the weight of truth. Being bound to a physical body, it's a trade-off for me. I don't see as well as the others, but I get an enjoyment from living that will forever elude those non-corporeal companions of mine. There are others who can see the same way you do? Mona asked. Mr. Vidier nodded. Just a handful. We are the curators, creators, and purveyors of art and culture. We look for beauty and balance, and we revel in perfection. As for me, specifically, I find myself to be more of a curator. Look around you. What do you think the value of my collection is? Shelley answered wisely. I don't think you could put a monetary value on what you have here. You're correct, Shelley. No amount of money could adequately represent the value of what we have here before us. But I have had people pay me more than $1 million for 24 hours of access to my collection, and I could easily ask for more. Shelley spoke up. So that's what this is about? Having people pay you to see what's in here? No, Mr. Vidier was stern. That's not at all what this is about. That's simply an unavoidable reality that pops up from time to time. The bills must be paid, you see. Why don't you share this with the entire world? Shelley asked. So they could corrupt it? So it could lose its value? Believe me, I've given the world more than enough. This collection is for me, and for those I choose to allow in here. The moment of seriousness was broken when Mona gently raised her hand and brushed it against Mr. Vidier's arm. I don't blame you. It's wonderful what you have here. Too many people knowing about it would just ruin it. She bit her lower lip. The man, for the first time, looked toward Mona with some lust in his eyes. He then turned towards Shelley and spoke. My dear, maybe tomorrow you should take advantage of the afternoon sunlight. You don't need to come in so early. There's a park down the street which will give you some amazing opportunities. He turned back and addressed Mona. And while she's out, we can use that time to discuss your story and get to know each other better. Mona understood the look in Mr. Vidier's eyes, and her heart jumped in her chest. She immediately imagined herself lying on the couch, her legs spread apart, and Mr. Vidier thrusting on top of her. She shook with nervousness and excitement. Yes, I'd love to discuss my story with you alone, Mr. Vidier. Marcus. My name is Marcus. I'd love nothing more than that, Marcus. Shelley watched as the two people in the room planned a date without her. For the first time since they'd met Mr. Vidir, she felt truly jealous. She wasn't sure if she was more upset at losing time with Mr. Vidir, or if it was because Mona was being drawn away from her. The next day, Shelley stayed out well into the afternoon, taking photographs of anything that held her interest. She felt a strong urge to show up at Mr. Vidir's place early, but she ultimately decided that interrupting the two of them would come off as immature. Mona's day was quite different. She slept in late so that she would have plenty of energy for later in the day. She was happy, nervous, and excited all at once. She went through her closet, trying on several dresses. She first selected a tight black dress and looked at herself in a full-length mirror, then shook her head. "Too slutty," she said to herself as she slinked out of it and left it on the floor. She finally found a dress that she felt was perfect. It was a dark, form-fitting outfit, but it left enough to the imagination so that Mona still felt a little bit classy. She straightened her hair and applied her favorite crimson lipstick. The last thing she did before leaving was go into her roommate's bedroom and grab some condoms from the nightstand drawer, but she put them back after deciding that she didn't want any sort of barrier between her and Mr. Vidir. This wasn't going to be the first sexual experience for Mona, not even close, but it would be the first time with someone that she truly cared for. It was mid-afternoon when Mona arrived. She felt a bit odd being so dressed up in a place where she'd always been casual, but carried herself confidently nonetheless. She opened the door and walked in. Mr. Vidir was sitting on one of the couches in the back room. She smiled mischievously and spoke a sultry salutation. "Hello, Marcus." Her voice had a beautiful song-like sound to it. He turned his head and stared at her coldly. Her smile faltered a bit. "Is everything okay?" "Sit down," he said curtly. "We'll discuss your story now." He didn't seem to notice or appreciate the effort she'd put into making herself pretty. Mona sensed something was terribly wrong as she sat next to Mr. Vidir. The mysterious man held up the printed pages that Mona had brought to him on her second day there. "This is some of the worst writing I've ever had the displeasure of reading. Your characters have no life, and your plot is poorly paced. The entire thing is terrible. I could go into detail about how dreadful this all is, but it would be a waste of our time." His cruel words pierced her soul all the way through. She waited for a minute in shock, then tried her best to salvage the situation. "You can help me get better, Marcus. You can show me how." She attempted to regain her smile, but her lower lip only quivered. "No. You're an insipid girl with ridiculous ideas. Look at yourself. You're dressed like a disgusting trollop. Did you really think that a piece of trash like you could seduce me?" Mona looked down at herself, then back at Mr. Vidir. "Please stop joking around, Marcus." She desperately reached out to him, hoping that he'd take her hand. "Put your hand down, you pig. I would never touch you." There was no feeling or remorse in his voice. It contained only a cold quality that made her feel miserable. Mona began crying. "Please, don't do this to me, Mr. Vidir. I don't understand what's happening. I feel awful right now." "Do you feel as bad as that time when you were 15 and you took all those pills?" Mona met his steely glare with confusion in her eyes and managed to ask a tortured question between her sobs. "How do you know about that?" He ignored the question and handed her the pages of her story. "Here, please throw these in the garbage on your way out. I'm done with you, and I don't want you to ever come back here." Mona tried to make sense of the situation.
You're doing all this because you don't like my story?
No, I'm doing this because I don't like you. An overwhelmed Mona stood up and began shuffling towards the exit. She paused in the doorway and wiped the tears from her face as she made her final apology.
Whatever I did to make you upset, I'm sorry.
His last words towards Mona were perhaps the cruelest of the lot. It upsets me that people like you even exist, Miss Darling. He walked to the doorway and watched her as she exited onto the sidewalk. She wiped the tears from her face as she shuffled away slowly. Once she was out of sight, he removed the open sign from the window and locked the door. Still holding on to the pages of her story, Mona headed in the direction of the park where she knew Shelley would be taking pictures.
Where are you, Shelley?
She wondered. She took out her phone as if she was going to make a call, but it slipped through her tear-stroked fingers and fell to the ground. She made no attempt to pick it up. The sights surrounding her blended together into a singular drab gray form. She meandered silently through the streets, without even being aware of how long she had been walking. Eventually, she saw in front of her a large 5-story parking garage that held cars for a nearby hospital. With no real plan in mind, she started climbing the stairs, floor by floor. As she ascended, her emotions began shutting down, as if the cost of admission to each level was part of her very soul. She made it to the top floor, where a cool breeze gently swept the hair from her face. Moving closer to the edge of the structure, she took a moment to view the city. She saw that everything was peaceful and calm. She held out her arm, and one by one, she let the pages of her story slip from her grasp and flutter over the side. They flashed intermittently as they caught the afternoon sunlight. Mona mused that it looked like a disorganized flock of birds, and she managed a small smile at that thought. There was a short wall that separated her from the drop-off, but it was easy enough for her to climb on top of it. She stood there and took a moment to let the sunshine warm her. Then she closed her eyes and took a step forward. Her fall was much quicker than that of her pages. On the ground below, Shelley's attention had been caught by the fluttering papers drifting downward. Looking for their source, she immediately recognized Mona standing up on the ledge. Even though she couldn't think of a reasonable explanation for her friend to be in that spot, she was sure it was her. Before Shelley could even process what she was witnessing, Mona stepped forward and began to fall. A large crash sounded as she landed. Arriving at the site of impact, Shelley gasped at what she saw. Mona, having landed atop a car, was unmistakably dead. The awkward angle between her head and body made that much clear. Yet as Shelley looked closer, she noticed that Mona had a peaceful look about her, as if a huge burden had been lifted from her. The car's roof had crumpled around her, cradling her lifeless form. A trickle of blood ran from her mouth and blended with her crimson lipstick. Another trickle of blood dripped out of her ear. As the reality of the sight set in, Shelley asked a question that could never be answered.
Why did you do this?
She shook her head back and forth in agony.
You were such a beautiful person.
She wanted to cry, yet her gut instinct gave her pause. The tableau in front of her was nearly complete, and it begged for some sort of preservation. The camera's display showed that she had only enough film for one more picture. She reached forward and adjusted Mona's hair so that it covered the blood running from her ear. The blood running from her mouth felt more appropriate. There was no need to cover that up. Continuing to hold her tears in check, Shelley whispered a promise to her dead best friend.
I'll keep you beautiful forever, Mona.
She kneeled and found the perfect position without even thinking about it. The camera clicked, then fell loosely against her body as she released her grip. It was soon covered in the teardrops that flowed freely from Shelley's face. 2 weeks passed before Shelley felt emotionally ready to return to Mr. Vidier's place. The open sign that had once greeted her and Mona was missing, but the door was unlocked. Shelley entered without hesitating. Mr. Vidier came from the back room. Skipping any sort of pleasantries, Shelley addressed him curtly.
You're aware of what happened to Mona, right?
Yes, I know what happened. The police investigator you sent my way told me all about it. It's very tragic. He looked at the backpack Shelley was carrying. Do you have something for me? A roll of film, perhaps?
I don't know.
She paused for a moment as she tried to size up Mr. Vidier's intentions.
I want to know what happened between you two first.
We spoke about her story, then she left. He looked at the backpack again, then spoke in his most fatherly voice. Shelley, you're here for a reason. Let's see what's on those rolls of film. Maybe it will ease your pain. Shelley wanted to scream and demand real answers about what had happened to Mona, but a strange calm settled over her as she listened to the man's voice. Hesitantly, she went into the darkroom and developed her final role. She worked quietly and efficiently, at times moving in complete darkness. Her fluid movements echoed that of someone with far more experience. Everything Mr. Vidier had taught her came into play as she navigated through the complex process. It was much later when Mr. Vidier finally entered the darkroom. Shelley was seated in the corner, emotionally spent from the process of watching her last photograph slowly arrive at its final form. He picked up the photo and its negative and gave an uncharacteristic gasp of surprise and delight. This is exceptional. This turned out much better than I imagined. Shelley questioned his last statement.
Better than you imagined?
She followed him as he left the darkroom. He held the photo at arm's length to study it further. This is one for the ages. In the photograph, he could see Mona's lifeless body. A small, mysterious smirk crossed her lips. It was accentuated by the drops of blood running from her mouth. The roof of the car had caved in around her, yet if one looked at just the right angle, the folds of metal almost looked like a giant hand holding her in repose. A shaft of light, which had sneaked through 2 nearby buildings, bathed Mona's body eerily, as if it were calling her into the heavens. One could almost mistake Mona for someone who was simply resting. She was peaceful. She was beautiful. She was dead. You've done an excellent job, Shelley. This is the most beautiful photograph I've ever seen. I couldn't have asked for better results from the two of you. We'll count this as your payment.
Payment?
Shelley didn't understand what was happening.
Payment for what?
Payment for shaping you as an artist. Before you came here, you were one of the most naturally talented photographers I'd ever sensed. You only needed some small pushes in the right direction. You needed some advice, you needed some inspiration, but most of all, you needed to understand the full range of human emotion. You came here understanding love, and now you understand loss as well. An artist needs to fully comprehend both of those, and everything in between, before they can capture the truest beauty. Shelley looked closely at Mr. Vidier. Even though his facial features were unchanged, he no longer reminded her of her father. It was as if a veil had been lifted. She looked around the room. Everything was in its place, yet nothing seemed as vibrant and magical as it had before. Her anger suddenly rose to the surface.
You asshole! Mona wasn't some sort of lesson. She was a beautiful person.
Mr. Vidier nodded. I agree. She was beautiful. And now she'll be added to the most magnificent collection of art in existence.
No, I don't agree to this.
Shelley looked for the photograph so that she could tear it in two.
Mona was worth far more than a stupid fucking photograph. I loved her.
Her eyes darted over the nearby table and then to Mr. Vidier, but the photograph was no longer present.
Where did it go?
Shelley demanded. It's already been added to the collection. Now it's your job to go out into the world and make yourself famous. Make my assortment even more extraordinary than it already is.
And what if I refuse?
No harm will befall you, if that's what you're asking, but I'm reasonably sure you won't take that route. Remember, I see things. Maybe not as well as some of my colleagues, but I can tell that you will be very well known. 200 years from now, students will be studying your techniques, and scholars will be amazed at your accomplishments. It will have all started with one photograph, the same one that I now have in my possession. Mr. Vidier handed the camera to Shelley. You can keep this. It's a gift. Rage filled Shelley's face as she lifted the camera above her head with the intention of throwing it against the wall, but after a brief pause, she brought it back down and shoved it into her backpack. She brushed against Mr. Vidier with some force as she stormed out of his place forever.
Fuck you, you piece of shit. Now I understand hate too, she shouted on her way out.
Mr. Vidier exited the back room and watched through the windows as Shelley slowly disappeared down the street. He smiled and spoke aloud. It's been a true honor to know you, Shelley Hester. You will be one of the all-time greats.
I hope you enjoyed Second Seer, a story of death and beauty, written by Thomas O. and narrated by Nick Goroff. Nick Goroff is a film and voice actor who you can hear plenty more from on this channel. He recently finished shooting the upcoming horror film Rarer Media, in which he starred as the lead role. Rarer Media is expected to hit theaters later this year, and we'll be sure to keep you posted. Thomas O. is a well-known author in the creepypasta world, and has 3 books published with our friends at Velox Books, your source for primo nightmare fuel. Visit veloxbooks.com to check out Thomas O. and all your other favorite authors. His books are available in Kindle, print, and audio. If you enjoyed tonight's episode, you could support us by leaving a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you're listening. Watching on YouTube? Like, subscribe, and if you're feeling chatty, leave us a comment. And for even more horror, head over to chillingtalesfordarknights.com to become a patron. You'll get ad-free episodes, exclusive stories, and early access to brand new nightmares before anyone else for just $7.99 a month, or less with an annual plan. Your support keeps the darkness alive, and we sincerely appreciate it. I'm Geoff Sturtevant, and it's been my pleasure to present tonight's terrifying tale. I hope to have some company next time, so be sure to come back next week as we once again turn off the lights and turn on the dark. Sweet dreams, listeners. Sweet dreams.